Hello, and welcome to today's important and timely discussion, a debrief with United States policymakers on the recent Oslo Afghan talks. I'm Melanne Verveer, and I direct the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. Amid a deteriorating humanitarian and human rights crisis in Afghanistan, representatives of the European Union, Germany, Italy, Norway, the United Kingdom, and the United States met in Oslo on January the 24th at the invitation of the Norwegian government for a round of meetings that included representatives of Afghan civil society and the Taliban. Rina Amiri, the United States Special Envoy for Afghan Women, Girls, and Human Rights, and Maria Longi, the Deputy Assistant Administrator for USAID's Asia Bureau, where she oversees Afghanistan and Pakistan, were members of the United States delegation, and they will lead this briefing. Rina Amiri previously served in the Obama administration as a senior advisor to the United States Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. She brings over 2 decades of political expertise advising and working with governments in various conflict settings. Her areas of focus have been peace and security, with a specialization in inclusion and mediation processes. And she has served in the UN in several capacities, including as a senior mediation expert and member of the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General's political team in Afghanistan during the implementation of the Bonn Agreement. She has also held senior positions in a number of universities and think tanks, always championing the rights of women and girls for decades. She is a founding member of Inclusive Security, the NGO. Maria Longi joined USAID's Asia Bureau after serving as the Chief Operating Officer for USAID's COVID Task Force. Earlier, she was Associate Dean for Outreach and Research at the National War College. And before holding that position, she served as USAID's Acting Administrator for the Middle East. Before joining USAID, she served in the State Department and earlier at the Millennium Challenge Corporation and in other significant positions. Obviously, in Rina and Maria, we have 2 very expert and deeply committed public servants, and we're so pleased to have both of them with us today. The event will have simultaneous English Dari language interpretation. On the bottom of your screen, click the interpretation button, which has a round globe symbol. If you're on a mobile device, you will find 3 dots in the corner and then language interpretation. Click English if you'd like to listen in English, and Dari if you'd like to listen in Dari. We have some 700 participants joining us on Zoom today and even more on Facebook, and we welcome each and every one of you. Here's how we will proceed. I will ask Rina and Maria 2 rounds of questions, and then we will immediately turn to questions that were pre-submitted by the audience, and we'll go for as long as we can during the next hour. So Rina, welcome, and let me begin with you. The recent talks in Oslo on the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan were an opportunity for the international community to coordinate action and speak directly to the Taliban. As you are able to tell us, what were the key highlights and what were the key takeaways? And were there any significant areas of progress or particular challenges? Rina.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Verveer. And I want to thank the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security and USIP for co-hosting this discussion. And I also want to extend my thanks to Deputy Assistant Administrator Longi for joining us in this discussion. You know, when I took this position, I made a commitment that my office and my portfolio is about inclusion, and my process is going to be about inclusion and transparency. And this is my participating in this discussion is a delivery on that commitment. I believe that ultimately the best way to achieve any type of effective policy in Afghanistan is going to be determined by the degree to which we include Afghan voices, and to which we're open with the public in terms of what we're working on, what challenges we face, and really being realistic, both in terms of what our leverage is, what the possibilities are, and to solicit just the rich level of expertise, not just among the Afghan public, both inside and outside Afghanistan, but also the international community, civil society, think tanks that have been engaging in decades on this work. And given the challenges in Afghanistan, it has to be an effort that brings together all of these forces, and that's what I'm hoping that this is the beginning of. In terms of Oslo, I want to begin by noting that just a couple of details about the event itself. One, it was organized by the Norwegian government. It was not an easy task for them. They came under quite a bit of pressure domestically for organizing this meeting, and there were some concerns that should the international community be engaging the Taliban? Should it be engaging them so soon after the military takeover? And they took the risk of convening this meeting. And what I'm most appreciative of is that they made it very clear to the Taliban that if they were going to engage the international community, they would have to engage with Afghans themselves. And they put together a group of Afghan civil society actors, of which I believe half were women, and half from inside the country, and half who were either recent evacuees or those that had sustained an ongoing efforts in Afghanistan. It was a very solid group of people. And the meeting, the Taliban began their meetings with the Afghan civil society actors and had very intense and frank discussions sitting directly across Afghan women and men. And one of the representatives was, there were a number of women's rights activists, and one in particular took the opportunity to really hold the Taliban to account on the issue of the women detainees. In fact, she stood there with posters of the women detainees, just confronting them with the fact, just both verbally and optically, in terms of what was happening to women, which I thought was really powerful. And in terms of the U.S. delegation and the international representatives that participated, we began our meeting with civil society. We had a discussion with them after they had their meetings with the Taliban, and where they shared both their overall assessment and what they wanted going forward. And then we met with the Taliban as a group, and we also met with them bilaterally. In terms of the successes, or success, I think is too strong of a word, but maybe the more hopeful outcomes, and where there are concerns. The hopeful outcomes one was, I actually joined this delegation a week after starting my position officially in the government. And I was very heartened by the fact that I was the only woman special envoy representative on the side of the international community, but I didn't feel that I was at all alone in advocating for women's rights and inclusion. Every single representative underscored from the outset the importance of inclusion and women's rights. And human rights to the Taliban in very emphatic terms. And so I was reassured by the consistency and coherence of the messaging. Two, on education, on the part of the Taliban, I was reassured that this time they didn't hide behind caveats as they have in the past to the same extent. They noted that they were going to deliver on education, not because the international community wanted them to, but because it was a principle of Islam for women to be educated. That was the strongest language that I'd heard from them. I felt that overall, and in terms of the issue of detainees, I was also heartened that every single delegation mentioned the women by name who were missing and did not just accept the Taliban saying they didn't know where they were. In fact, they said, you are held accountable regardless. If you are putting yourself in the position where you say you are going to govern the country, then people cannot simply disappear. You have to have measures in place to identify and find these women, recover these women. And I think that the message was very effectively delivered that no longer will the international community accept the Taliban in terms of its hopeful rhetoric and promises. Whether it was on education or detainees, they have to deliver. And on education in particular, we highlighted that it's encouraging that they note that this is important to them. But March 21st is rapidly approaching, and girls have to be back in school day one, and it cannot just be at the primary and secondary level. It has to be at all levels, and we press them for an implementation plan. So those were the encouraging sides. What leaves me concerned is that there was very little that was concrete from what came from the Taliban. It was, a lot of, they did bring forward a delegation that included all of the technical ministries, but I had hoped to hear more concrete terms in terms of what they were prepared to do for the Afghan population. And on the issue of human rights and detentions, I feel that they still don't understand that it's not that to the international community that they're accountable on these issues, it's to the Afghan population that they're accountable. Women's rights and human rights is not a Western agenda, it is the agenda of the Afghan population. And I think that they still haven't quite internalized that message.
Thank you, Rina. Those were key highlights. And I wonder if we could go to Maria now, really with the same question and get your perspective.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that, Ambassador Verveer, and thank you for inviting us to join you today to talk about our trip and the work that we're doing. I would agree wholeheartedly with what Rina said about impressions of the engagement. She started a week before we left. I started 2 months before we left, and so I had not had the experience of the prior talks with the Taliban or working in Afghanistan over the years, as many of our colleagues have had that experience. But overall, I thought the conference was a very useful engagement with the Taliban representatives. We had the opportunity to talk to them on a more granular level, although not as granular as we would have liked, on the humanitarian and the human rights situations, about education, especially getting girls and women back in the classroom, and also about the dire liquidity crisis facing the country, which is relevant to a lot of these issues that we're talking about. I was also heartened by the cohesiveness of the messaging from our European colleagues. We all press for more inclusivity in governing, for making more opportunities for women to get to work across all sectors, and for continued access for humanitarian aid to get to the people. Those were very common themes, and we were very consistent. We also stressed the importance of allowing economic activity to happen and getting liquidity back into the market so they could progress beyond the immediate humanitarian crisis. And the Taliban representatives, they did have people from their economic ministries and from their central bank there to engage in these discussions. It was a great opportunity to hear from women and civil society representatives about their experiences and priorities. They're very passionate and brave people, and that came across as we sat across the table from them and talked to them outside of the meetings. They highlighted the human rights violations. They highlighted how important it is for the international community to still pay attention on the humanitarian front and pushing on inclusive governance. Some of them mentioned the future constitution of the country, which I think is a big issue that's floating out there. And while they were pleased to have these face-to-face meetings with Taliban representatives in Oslo, they clearly wanted to have these on a larger scale back in Afghanistan. They were somewhat, they're like, it's unfortunate that we had to come all the way here to be able to talk to them, but it's a good first step. And so they did have an optimistic tone as well. On education, we were pleased, as Rina said, about that they said the schools will open the end of March. Some of the universities have opened. It's not clear yet how many women are actually attending, but we have been hearing news reports that they are opening, which is good news. And we will be working very closely with our allies and partners to monitor what exactly that means as it goes forward. So we did hear some good things, not a lot of detail. We did press when we had the opportunity, especially in our bilateral meetings. But overall, I think it was a good step on engagement and dialogue. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. I think you've set the scene of what happened and highlighted some of the key points. Let me ask you, Rina, what are the plans of the United States government going forward with respect to Afghanistan? What are the priorities? And how will it address some of these really critical challenges from the humanitarian crisis to many of the human rights issues, et cetera?
Thank you, Melanne, for that question. It's a really critical and difficult juncture, and there's a need for the United States and the international community to work on multiple fronts. One, we're facing one of the worst humanitarian situations in the world in Afghanistan, and it's forecasted to get much worse. On the human rights front, unfortunately, what we've witnessed is, despite our very strong messaging to the Taliban, the trajectory is not one that we had hoped. In fact, there have been more detentions and growing concerns that the Taliban have not heard the message of Afghans and the international community in terms of addressing this issue. And in fact, it's gone quite the reverse. On the political front, there is the necessity for a pathway towards greater inclusivity, which is lacking. And just more broadly, from the economic and political front, there is a need for a system to be back in place, both for the health of the economy, an economic infrastructure to be back in place to enable the country to regain its footing to some extent. And there's work that's being done on all of these fronts. In the last month that I've been back in the government, I've seen that across the government there are efforts in this regard. Treasury is working on addressing issues of liquidity. On the area of sanctions, there have been 6 comfort letters and efforts to advance greater de-risking, particularly on the part of the private sector and banking, in order to inject cash back into the Afghan economy and to enable the country to get to a place where it actually has some of the the economic wherewithal just to get beyond the paralysis that it's there. In terms of the the humanitarian front, the U.S. is working very closely with the UN, the World Bank, a whole range of actors to identify how to mitigate the situation on the ground, and Maria can speak more to that. And on the human rights front, so before I get to that, on the education front, as Maria noted, we're going to be working very close with UNICEF, among others, to make sure that there's an operational plan to get girls back in school, to get students across the board back in school, but particularly girls. On the human rights front is where we're facing the greatest concern, because I've made the commitment I'm never going to sugarcoat what the situation is in the country, and more broadly in terms of the leverage of the international community. The US and the Western allies that have been at the forefront of supporting the women's rights agenda, the inclusion agenda, human rights, they don't have the leverage that they had in the past. There is not a presence on the ground. Almost all of the missions on the ground are from the region, which have not been as forthcoming in terms of pushing on the issues of human rights and women's rights. The US doesn't have a presence on the ground or the capacity to monitor the situation in any way. The one leverage that remains is the economic leverage, but at the same time, we have an enormously devastating humanitarian situation that needs to be addressed while trying to maintain that economic leverage to have some, come to the Taliban from a position of leverage vis-a-vis the fundamental issues of human rights and women's rights. And on the political front, I think what I hear so much from I've been having a lot of consultations with Afghan women and men, and what they say is this time, if the process has to be truly Afghan-led. And so in terms of a political pathway towards greater inclusivity, towards a government that's going to be accepted by all Afghans, there's going to be a need to really support the Afghans who are trying to come together and develop some level of approach towards reconciliation, whether that means a constitutional process, consultative mechanisms, a loy jirga, but it is Afghans who are going to be leading and the international community that will have to really listen to those voices, take in those voices and identify how to support them. On the issue of human rights, we have to come back and really assess where we are and how we're going to go forward. What I'm hearing from Afghan women and men is, during the peace process, for 2 years, the Taliban consistently flouted commitments and the peace process marched on. This time, it has to be different. This time, there has to be a response when the Taliban fail to deliver on their commitments to protect the rights of the Afghan population. And so far, we're not seeing that. And I think that there's going to be a need to recalibrate on the part of the international community and to have a united front. The minute that we start scattering and going in different directions, the Taliban gain strength and leverage. So the challenge for us will be to come together in a common position to make it very explicit to the Taliban that it's not our agenda. It is from the Afghan voices that we're hearing that they will not accept this an exclusive government that does not reflect the diversity and richness of the Afghan population, that squanders the economic opportunities that women play into. The UNDP has assessed that Afghanistan is going to lose $1 billion of income by preventing women from going back to work. So this is what we have to make absolutely clear to the Taliban, that it's not going to be business as usual, and we're not going to see peace before justice, humanitarian relief before justice, because they are all intertwined, and you can't address one side without the other side.
Well, that's very encouraging to hear, Rina, because there are so many challenges ahead. And I think the call for united front and U.S. leadership on this is an imperative. Maria, can you address the same issues in terms of the United States plans going forward, particularly from the platform that you have?
Yes, thank you. So on the humanitarian assistance, USAID and our partners, we've continued to provide extraordinary levels of assistance to support the Afghan people. The humanitarian appeal that the UN put out was $4.4 billion, is the largest they've ever had for a single country. And our efforts there have been ongoing, especially since August of 2021. Significantly, we did just announce over $300 million in new humanitarian aid just last month. And so we will continue to work on that front to try to help the world meet some of these humanitarian needs. After August of last year, we did pause all of our development assistance programs to review and assess. And so since then, more than a dozen of our programs have been rejiggered and have restarted with a focus on addressing critical needs of the Afghan people in several key sectors, namely health, education, food security, and livelihoods. So it's much more limited than what we did before, but we are outside of the humanitarian sphere focused on these very basic needs. And more programs could come online in the coming months based on the operating conditions. So we are continuing to work with both the partners that we had in Afghanistan as well as new partners to address these needs. And in the coming months, we hope that we will see additional aid and state programs that focus on Afghan civic leaders, journalists, and human rights activists to defend human rights and freedoms. And so we are looking at those areas too, in addition to the basic needs that I talked about. We are continuing to work very closely with our partners and other donors to ensure that we're closely coordinated, especially on monitoring the humanitarian assistance delivery, human rights, and education in other sectors. Not many of us are on the ground. Many of the UN entities are. And so we are relying on others, third-party monitors as our eyes and our ears. And this collaboration is going to be key for us being able to successfully continue our development and humanitarian work. And we'll also seek opportunities to engage further with Afghan civil society actors, Afghan women leaders, to inform our policy and programming decisions. And we appreciate this opportunity to hear from all of you on how you see the future of this work going. Thank you.
Thank you. There's critically a lot of work ahead for everybody. We're going to bring our audience in now, and I'm going to ask Allie Smith to read the questions that they've pre-submitted in hopes that we can get through as many as possible. And I think they're a reflection of what's on their minds that they want to raise with both of you. So Allie.
Thanks, Melanne. This first question is from an Afghan women's rights activist wishing to stay anonymous. She asks, the Oslo conference seemed to focus solely on education for women, but the right to work, political participation, and leadership are equally important. Some Afghan women are afraid that if the Taliban reopens school, they might get recognition while other rights would still be restricted. How can both these priorities be advanced at the same time? Perhaps we can start with you, Maria.
Sure, thank you. That's a great question. And I'm going to start with, and I might ask Rina to come in and supplement me, but I'm going to start with the education piece of this because it was a big theme for us and the other donors in Oslo, but it definitely was not the only issue and only human right that we did discuss. We do have to recognize the impressive achievements made in education in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades. As a result of all that work, more than 9 million children were enrolled in primary and secondary schools before the Taliban took over. And these are gains that AID and our partners feel very, very strongly about. And many of the other partners talked about this in Oslo as well. And we are very united with the international community in our desire that access to education be maintained to the levels that we saw prior to August of last year. In 2019, which is the last comprehensive set of data that we have on education, even in southern and eastern regions, which were traditional Taliban strongholds where education was more restricted for women and girls, we know that more than 20%, 30% of students were female. And in the urban areas of these same provinces, this was even higher. And so those are some targets that we would be looking to see going forward. And we did express this in our meetings with the Taliban representatives. But we also learned over the last 2 decades that through our past support to education, that that when women can work in the education sector and bring resources into the home, community support for education increases. And so it's not just in the schools that dealing with education affects, it's the whole community. And so we see this as a more kind of a holistic area for us to be engaging in. We also think that positive incentives can work in the education sphere, so we can both meet the urgent demand of families, girls and boys, to sustain their access to education, while also ensuring that the gains achieved over the last 2 decades are not lost. So to do this, we're working with the other donors in the education sector to ensure that we're working towards a common set of principles that are applied to our assistance. And we've done the same in the humanitarian sphere as well. And with this common voice towards the government representatives, we feel like we can have more of an influence. And some of those principles are around girls can go to school, that women can work in the school sector, both as teachers and administrators and in all types of jobs, and that they maintain a rigorous academic curriculum. And so I think those are some pieces that we're all in line with, and we did communicate that in our meetings. But as a final point here, monitoring is going to be complicated, and parsing the reasons why girls go to school or don't go is not going to be straightforward. I mean, schools have been closed since August. COVID is still a factor. The economy is weak. And so a lot of these factors are going to influence how we're looking at the data that comes out of this. And so I think that I'll stop there, and maybe, I don't know if Rina has anything to add to that one, but you know, we don't, I think on the education sphere, it is a place where the issue is coming up now. School is starting in March, and we've got an opportunity now to push, but it does have definite ripple effects throughout the communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I will weigh in just to note that and echo what Maria said, that we did not just simply put education on the table. Education on its own, without economic opportunity, without access to public space, without participation in the workforce, is not meaningful. And that's what we made very clear to the Taliban, and also the extent to which they're going to make Afghanistan lose revenue. You know, I cited the $1 billion, and you know, making it clear that the key to a sustainable Afghanistan that is not aid dependent is going to be on enabling women, who represent over 50% of the population, the right to work and the right to public space and participation across all sectors of the workforce. I mean, if you look at the Muslim world, prior to COVID, 150 million women in Muslim majority countries were part of the workforce. And this is across the Muslim world. And on the political front, 9 countries, including 3 of the most populous Muslim majority countries, have had women as leaders in government. These are things that the Taliban should look at. What they are doing is not a reflection of Islamic values. It's not a reflection of what's going on in the Muslim world. So what we're asking them to do is be consistent with Islamic values. This is not a Western value, and I think that's something that we all made clear. And I'm a Muslim, and having studied this issue for a very long time, and I, you know, it's a message that I conveyed, you know, both personally as well as, you know, in terms of my background educationally.
Thanks, Rina. Our next question here is from a senior official in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands, asking, how can international players ensure that Afghan women have a meaningful seat at the table in negotiations and play a central role in setting the agenda and priorities? Rina, do you want to take that one?
Yes. First, I would note that we need to hold the Taliban accountable to what they committed in Oslo. They said that they were going to have these meetings in Afghanistan. The first meeting should have actually been in Afghanistan, and they should continue. They should go back and convene women's groups, convene civil society, hear from the Afghan population themselves. So first, the onus should be on them. But in terms of the international community, I think, you know, despite what, you know, where people stand in terms of whether or not Oslo should have taken place, And the fact that the Norwegians said, if the Taliban come to Oslo, they have to meet with women in civil society. I thought that was a really important precedent. And what I have said from the outset in terms of my role is wherever the international community is going to meet with the Taliban, they should meet with women in civil society, and track 1.5 and track 2 efforts to one of the things that I did prior to going to the event was consult with Afghan women themselves on a range of issues and said, what are your priorities? I also looked at the statements, the 5 statements that Afghan women put together, and my messaging came from Afghan women themselves. I think that's something that the international community should do broadly. Engage Afghan women and men on the agenda, engage them on the messages that they want to underscore in the track 1 meetings. And then finally, I would note is that any future meetings should be contingent on the degree to which the Taliban actually deliver on issues in regard to women's participation across all fronts and on human rights issues. And if I can just say one final point, the leadership of the delegations that meet with the Taliban include women. You know, it shouldn't be a group of men sitting across the Taliban wagging their fingers about women's participation. It seems insincere.
Yeah. This next question, there's a few here on accountability mechanisms for aid delivery. So for Maria, can you speak to the mechanisms for accountability and implementation of humanitarian assistance in international aid delivery? What mechanisms are already in place to ensure aid sent into Afghanistan is reaching the people it intends to and is directly serving the Afghan people?
Sure. So you've heard from many AID folks before, I'm sure, but we're very committed to continuing to providing humanitarian assistance to vulnerable Afghans. And we're committed to doing this according to internationally recognized humanitarian principles, including neutrality, impartiality, and independence. We work very closely with our implementing partners, including the UN and the UN entities who are on the ground on delivering this assistance. Many of our partners work closely with the Afghan people, including women, to determine the best ways to deliver the humanitarian aid. We recognize that Afghan women play a central role in ensuring the effective and equitable distribution of humanitarian assistance within their communities because of the roles that they play. And as we move forward, we'll continue to consult with Afghan women leaders on how best to achieve this without putting them at risk, both as the deliverers and the recipients of this humanitarian aid. Now, both in our direct negotiations with the Taliban and through the UN leadership, we have emphasized that the de facto authorities must allow unrestricted, impartial, and independent needs assessments without imposing limitations on the delivery of aid based on gender, religion, ethnicity, or other demographic characteristics. And as such, our humanitarian partners, in coordination with us, conduct rigorous needs assessments, establishing our beneficiary selection, and determining priority assistance distribution locations. We do use third-party monitoring partners, open source data and performance and situational data from partners to verify that assistance is reaching the targeted areas and beneficiaries. And we're also ensuring that our assistance reaches women and girls in need by advocating for the participation of women in all aspects of aid delivery. And we did this in Oslo as well. But we do hear reports of interference, and when we hear these, we address them directly through channels that have been established for aid delivery. In many cases, this is through the UN entities that are on the ground, and so we have found that, at least with the situations that have come to our knowledge and that we have information on, we do try to address those as quickly as possible, and in general, we've been able to kind of break through the issues that have arisen. But definitely, we do get reports and we do follow up on those. So thank you.
Thank you. Next question here is for Rina, asking, why did you choose to wear the chador at the Oslo talks?
Thank you. Yes, I know that this was an issue of concern to some. I'll begin by noting for the last 20 years and living in Afghanistan and working and going back and forth in Afghanistan, I've always worn the chador, the veil. And I've done it for not for religious reasons. I'm a Muslim, but I believe that a Muslim woman, that the issue of dress, it's personal, and it's it's one in which it comes from how one views, how one practices one's religion. But in Afghanistan, I did it for a number of different reasons, and why I continue to do it. And at the very top of that list is effectiveness. I'm a negotiator and mediator by training, and I've trained diplomats from all over the world. And one of the things that I always tell them is, when you go into talks, take an inventory of who you are, everything about you, your gender, your background, your accent, which part of the world you come from, and assess to what degree it's going to be a liability and to what degree it can be an asset. And you're not there to deliver a personal message through your dress. You're not there to make a statement. You're there to make yourself effective in delivering statements. And for me, when I made that inventory, my assessment was that wearing a chador would be more effective in engaging the Taliban and delivering the messages that I was bringing from Afghan women themselves. I don't, despite my Afghan heritage, I don't claim to represent Afghan women. That's not my role. I'm there to deliver the messages and the priorities of Afghan women. And I was there to demonstrate that to Afghans, to the Taliban, that Afghan women, the leadership of Afghan women, had a number of issues that they were putting on the table, that this was not coming from the international community, from Afghans. And if putting on a veil enabled me to deliver that message more effectively, then I deemed that that was the appropriate course of action. And I will continue to wear a veil where I deem it necessary and effective. And it comes from a position of strategy and effectiveness.
Rina. This next question is from Homa Hudfar at Concordia University. She is asking, to what extent was this consultation successful in putting pressure on the Taliban to acknowledge that governing a nation is not the same as ruling them by force of gun? Rina, perhaps you want to take that?
Well, it was a message that was certainly delivered from our delegation, as well as from all of the international representatives that were at the table. But the degree to which they understand this is the degree to which they understand that they have not ended the war, and the war is on pause. To succeed in ending over 40 years of war in Afghanistan, they have to bring about an inclusive
Rina, can you hear us? I think we've lost Rina here. Maria, you mind if I move on to a question for you?
Sure.
Fabulous. This question here is asking about the difference that civil society around the world can make towards the human rights of women and girls in Afghanistan, and efforts that USAID has underway right now to specifically support Afghan civil society.
Yeah, so we have, as I said at the beginning, we are looking to restart some civil society work, and that is Rina back? And that is in train. And so we talk to journalists, we talk to others, and the more people that we can talk to, the better we can shape our future programming. I think what I heard in Oslo from the Taliban representatives, they are listening to the media. They are listening to the voices that are outside. They say it's noise. It's not true. But I think that civil society outside of Afghanistan being vocal is being heard, and I think there definitely is a role that they can play, and we will continue to try to use our assistance to help the civil society actors and leaders that are within the country. And we work closely with Rina and the team at the State Department to make sure that is as targeted as possible.
Hello, Rina.
Sorry, I was disconnected. Just having technical issues on my end, but just to know that throughout Afghan history, any government that has tried to impose its policies without hearing the voices of Afghans, without including the voices of Afghans throughout the country, has failed. The Taliban should recognize that, understand that. Even in the last 20 years, I don't even think that the Karzai and the Ghani administration sufficiently brought in the voices of Afghans, and its shortcomings was very much as a result of that. So if the Taliban really hopes to achieve some level of arriving at governing Afghanistan in a meaningful way, it needs a process that respects human rights, that's inclusive, that really embraces the Afghan population. Power can be determined by, you can get power through crushing people or lifting them up. If they lift the country, the people of Afghanistan up, they're much more likely to succeed in arriving at an end of this very long and devastating war.
And then we have one final question here asking, does the Taliban appear to be beginning to recognize the connection between acceptance of democratic norms and the importance of individual human rights and recognition by the international community? Rina?
As I noted, the representatives in Oslo were very clear and emphatic on this issue. But I do hope that what the Taliban arrive at, again, they should be looking inward inside the country, whether it's legitimacy, acceptance by the Afghan population. All of that is going to be contingent to the degree to which they honor and respect the rights of the Afghan population. So they shouldn't simply do it because they want to gain greater legitimacy from the international community. Even if they do that, ultimately they will fail unless they, the concept of hearts and minds is something that we use a lot and talking about policy in any part of the world. And the Taliban have to recognize that simply repressing and trying to govern through a policy of fear and repression is short-term, and it's going to end up badly for the entire country. And the region should recognize that it's going to engender enormous level of instability. So human rights, women's rights is going to be fundamental from not just a position of principle and norms, but from strategy and from trying to end this, this war that should have come to an end a long time ago.
Ali, does that exhaust the questions from our audience?
We do have one more here. If either of you want to touch on this, asking if you can offer any advice or words of support or hope specifically for Afghan refugees here in the United States who are worried about their family members in Afghanistan.
Now, I think that is, I get calls, I get emails, and I think many of us do, from Afghans, people that we know, people that we've been connected to in some way, and people that we have never come across. Everyone, both from outside, those that have been recently exiled, as well as those inside the country, where it's a tremendously difficult situation. And the U.S.'s government is trying to address this on two fronts. I was appointed to try to work on the challenges on the ground in terms of engendering or pushing for a policy that respects the rights of women and the broader Afghan population, communities at risk, to work with Special Representative Tom West and USAID and others to address the enormous economic challenges on the ground. And in addition to my role, Stephanie Foster was appointed as a senior advisor to work on the issue of evacuation and resettlement. And there is a full team that's working on that issue. I know that it all is woefully insufficient right now to the challenges that Afghans, even those that have been fortunate enough to find a way out, but both those outside as well as those inside, there's just a tremendous need. And what I would appeal is for countries, neighboring countries, European allies, for the world to open its doors to Afghans who are in dire need or in positions of vulnerability and threat. I think it's incumbent upon us to find ways to help those that are most at risk evacuate, even if it's temporary or longer term. And even more important is working and redoubling our efforts to try to stabilize the situation in Afghanistan from a humanitarian and economic human rights front at all levels. The world has said that they're standing by Afghanistan for the last 20 years. We need to honor that commitment, even when it's as difficult as it is, and even more importantly, when it's this difficult.
Rina, seen one more in the chat here asking, in addition to the women activists that the Taliban have detained, there are a large number of other Afghans as well as others who are detained by the Taliban for expressing their views. Did the US delegation call on the Taliban to release all of those detained in violation of international norms?
Absolutely. And we didn't just ask for them to release. We asked them to stop detaining human rights activists, women's rights activists, Afghans who are doing nothing. They were not committing a crime. They're just asking for their basic and fundamental rights. And it's incumbent on the Taliban to stop arresting and harassing Afghans who are standing not just for for their constituencies. They're standing for the rights of all Afghans. They're trying to engender accountability. They are trying to help improve the situation and are just the most courageous human beings, I think, right now on the planet. It's not going to be sufficient for the Taliban just to release a few people, although we urgently press on them to release all of these individuals, but they must stop this practice of detaining, or even when they say that they don't know where these individuals are. It's their responsibility. Right now they are telling the world that they're governing Afghanistan, or governance includes accountability, ensuring that if people are disappearing, it's incumbent upon them to have an investigative process to identify these people, to where they are, to release them, and to hold those accountable that are seizing these people.
Thanks, Rina. I'm seeing another one just come through here. How can we best use the UNAMA mandate renewal to strengthen a message from a united international community on human rights?
I'm so glad that question came up. And Maria, please weigh in. I'm sorry that a lot of this is coming to my direction. I think the role of UNAMA is absolutely critical. Right now, really the eyes and ears of the world are UNAMA in terms of addressing the situation in Afghanistan. The UNAMA mandate is coming up for renewal, and it's going to be absolutely critical that the UNAMA remains robust and that it has a presence throughout the country, that its human rights unit is maintained. And this is something that all of the Security Council members should see as something that should be supported. It's not about supporting Western values. It's about helping press the Taliban, hold them accountable on everything from human rights to inclusive mechanisms, to working with them to engender a process that's ultimately going to be sustainable. Otherwise, the region will pay, European countries will pay, everyone will pay in one way or another, even if they look at it from narrow interests of not wanting refugees to come across their border. You know, I hope that it's broader than that and looking at it from a lens of humanity. But you know, I mean, I'm cognizant that, you know, most of the time with member states look at their specific interests, and I think it is going to be of vital interest to ensure that we have a very strong UN presence on the ground, and that we also support the UN Special Rapporteur that's going to be appointed soon. Those should be supported and seen as allies towards stabilizing an Afghanistan where the rights of the population are protected, which will enable, you know, this enormous resource in Afghanistan to engender economic stability, political stability, and have an Afghanistan that is at peace with itself. It's contingent on that population being protected, and UNAMA will have a really important role in that regard. I know that Maria may want to talk about other dimensions, including the humanitarian. I would also highlight that the UNAMA political role should also be maintained so that it could use its good offices to the end of engendering greater political inclusivity or supporting greater political inclusivity. Maria, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, the only thing that I would add is that that I fully agree that the continued mandate is extremely important. We are physically not there; they are, and so their political role and their role telling us what's going on, helping with some of the messaging. They are meeting with officials there, and it is extremely helpful to not only us but the rest of the international community to make sure. You know, partly that we're in touch better than we're able to be from afar. And so we do see it as very important, and in our hopefully we will get a good strong mandate coming out of this next negotiation.
Well, thank you both for really grappling with a range of questions from our audience. I think it's important to say that there are many who are concerned that in engaging with the Taliban, somehow that will represent eventual recognition. We can separate engagement from recognition. And I think you both agree that we've got to continue to engage because of all of the challenges that have been discussed today and more. Would you concur?
Yeah, I think we need to be realistic right now and cognizant of a situation that, you know, that is hard to wrestle with, but the Taliban are the reality on the ground. They have to be engaged both on, you know, addressing the plight of a population that is on the risk of enormous food insecurity, and women and children bear the brunt of that. It is incumbent on us to engage them to ensure that the way that, you know, our ability to engage and work on that front, on the human rights front, right now, as I noted, we don't have a presence on the ground. Most of the countries that really supported the issues of women's rights, human rights, political inclusion, they no longer have a presence. There's a necessity right now to work with them. That being said, as I said earlier, our engagement has to be calibrated. That if the Taliban continue to crack down on the rights of the Afghan population, then that has to be taken into account. And the international community has to recalibrate and identify how it's going to, how it's, what its posture is going to be vis-a-vis the Taliban. I think that is of critical importance for them to realize that the situation is quite different, and they will be held to their commitments.
Well, I think the presence and participation of both of you represents your willingness to continue to conduct these kinds of briefings to keep people informed about where the situation is and where it is going. And hopefully there will be times in the future when we can get together again and have this kind of very free exchange with you both. In the meantime, we wish you well. There is much to do, and we will say goodbye until we can come back together again. So thank you both, and thank everyone who participated today.
Thank you very much.